So thank you everybody for joining the last session. This is the fifth and final session of our seminar about challenges of security and justice provision in Latin America. Today, we decided to add this final session regarding the provision of justice, the challenges of provision of justice in Latin America, either how to make more effective the state or organized judicial branch, or how to understand the regulation of different forms of social forms or criminal forms, even of justice provision and regulation in Latin America. So we have today another marvelous set of three panelists who have kindly and generously joined us in this session. One is Ana Arjona. Ana is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University. She was the director of the Center for the Study of Security and Drugs at Los Andes University in Bogota. She is now an associate researcher there, and she obtained a PhD in political science in Yale University, and currently is a professor at Northwestern. Among many publications of extraordinary quality, Ana is the author of the award-winning book, Rebelocracy, Social Order in the Colombian Civil War, is co-editor of Rebel Governance and Civil War, and author of several articles and books in this field. And we are very pleased to have her here with us. Our second fantastic panelist is Deborah Boucoyannis. Deborah specializes in comparative politics, especially the theoretical and historical origins of liberalism and the state. She has also published in the History of Political Economy and International Relations Theory. Her book, Kings as Judges, Power, Justice, and the Origins of Parliaments, is the first systematic account of how judicial institutions, not war or trade, led to the emergence of representative institutions and state formation in Western Europe. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago, was an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. Prior to her doctoral studies, she was a lecturer in the Committee of the Social Studies at Harvard University. So we are also very pleased to have Deborah today for our discussion. And last but not least, is Professor Daniel Brinks, who's professor of government and of law at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the chair of the government department and is active in the fields of comparative politics and public law. He's a senior researcher and global scholar of the Center on Law and Social Transformations, and which is a joint project of the University of Bergen and Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. Professor Brinks, his most recent book, The DNA of a Constitutional Justice in Latin America, Politics, Governance, and Judicial Design, examines constitutional change in Latin America since 1975, focusing especially on judicial institutions and constitutional review. Other recent books, in collaboration with our very own Steve Levitsky and with Vicky Murillo, seek to understand what we mean by and the political origins of weak institutions in Latin America. Understand institutional weakness, power, and design in Latin American institutions, and the politics of institutional weakness in Latin America, both from Cambridge University Press are part of that work. So we are really thankful and pleased to have them three to discuss this really double challenge, at least, or maybe more than double challenge, of making more effective the state institutions, the judicial institutions we have in place to provide, to defeat impunity, to provide conflict resolution and justice provision. But at the same time, we also have competitors, if we want to mention them by that name, competitors, either social competitors of conflict resolution and justice provision, or either even criminal organizations, competitors of provision of justice. So to discuss this topic, we're going to have about 15, no more than 20 minutes for each of them. And at the end, we open up for questions in the topic. So Ana, if you want to start.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to share. Okay, can you see it there?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you again, Claudia, for the invitation, and Paola and Stephen. I'm going to be talking about, so I thought that most of the ideas that I had for this discussion are best summarized in this paper that I have with Andrew Sapp, who is not joining us, but he's my co-author, where I think we show evidence of some of the questions and ideas that I think we should be thinking about, especially for Latin America, as we think of the expansion of criminal governance. So a very common assumption in the literatures on different types of non-state armed groups, rebels, criminals, gangs, is that these groups thrive where the state is absent or weak, right? We see this in all kinds of literatures. We also see that a common solution is build the state, and this will undermine these non-state armed groups. And usually this means providing security, providing services, especially health and education, and building infrastructure. So the question that we ask in this paper is the following: is the scope of non-state armed governance, so rebel or criminal governance, broader where the state is weak, and which components of state capacity matter more for this? So just a definition so that we're all on the same page. By non-state armed governance, I am referring to situations where a rebel, a criminal group, a gang regulates conduct. So they impose rules for people in different domains of life, and they may provide services in a local territory where the group is operating. This is very common. So for those of you who don't study this has been demonstrated in a lot of civil wars, and more recently in places where criminal organizations operate, especially in Latin America, although there is work in other regions of the world. But now most of what we know is based on Latin America, and there are some estimations of the number of people who live under criminal governance regimes by Ben Lessing and his co-authors, and it's hundreds of millions of people. So this is very important. I'm going to mention just a few reasons why we should care about this. When these groups govern, they get more civilian cooperation. It's easier for them to capture the state or collude with the state or coerce the state. This makes these groups more powerful, more difficult to fight. And while they may offer some improvements for residents, which is something that we should acknowledge, it's important for policy and for understanding this phenomena, they also violate basic rights and freedoms in a very brutal way. And so in general, governance by these groups exacerbates the challenges posed by civil war and organized crime more generally. Okay, so as I said before, the common argument is that state weakness favors these groups, right? And I want to specify the mechanisms that are usually implicit in this account. So one is that if you have state weakness or state absence, then there is a very low opportunity cost for cooperating with non-state armed groups. The second one is grievances, right? So the state is not present, or is present, but its quality is very poor, then the state is less legitimate, and these grievances facilitate civilians' engagement and cooperation and sort of embracing governance by non-state armed actors. And then finally, because the state is not governing and is not providing security and is not providing services, then this demand is met by these groups. In the organized crime literature, the additional argument is also that poor state quality facilitates corruption, right? And this helps these groups, it undermines state capacity, the quality of democracy, and so on and so forth. So the argument that I'm going to make today, that we make in the paper, is based on three premises, or we're making three statements. So the first one is that what really matters is the quality of governance more than its source. So how is governance being provided in a locality? It doesn't matter if it's the state or not. The second one is that dispute resolution is as critical as security, services like health and education and infrastructure, even though it is usually overlooked. And in the paper, we show that it really has been overlooked in a lot of these debates. And then the third one that I think it's very important and very difficult to translate this finding into clear policy implications, and I look forward to the discussion, is that, of course, the state can improve governance and then reduce the scope of non-state armed governance, but the state can also increase the scope or the ability of these groups to govern by disrupting existing dispute resolution institutions that are in place when the armed group arrives. So let me just give you the logic behind these three arguments, and then I'll show you some of the data. So the first one is that if the argument for state capacity and state weakness being a very strong factor that causes or facilitates the consolidation of power and governance of these groups is true, well, we actually should see that governance provided by other groups would trigger the same mechanisms, right? If it's an indigenous community, if it's a cooperative of peasants, if they are governing well, they are going to trigger the same mechanism. So what matters is really the quality of governance and not their source. So we should not focus so much on whether the state is strong or weak, but more on whether governance is poor or high quality, if it's weak or if it's strong. The second argument is that when we look at the different components of state capacity, it makes sense to expect that security, education, health, and infrastructure matters because they all affect the mechanisms that I mentioned before: opportunity costs, grievances, and demand for new governance. But dispute resolution institutions, which I will be referring to as DRIs, they are a core function of governance. They are a pillar of social order because it enables cooperation, and it actually predates health, education, and infrastructure, right? So with Deborah, we have a paper where we provide a lot of evidence on this. Their justice provision has been one of the most basic and common services that any ruler has provided, right? And it is very important because without it, it's impossible to have any form of social, political, economic cooperation. People need to have a shared mechanism for solving disputes. So we argue that dispute resolution institutions is an essential component of this capacity of the state. It's going to trigger the same things. It's going to affect opportunity costs, grievances, and the demand for new governance. But in addition, it triggers unique mechanisms. So the first part of this, it builds on my book on rebelocracy, where I argue that high-quality dispute resolution institutions, by which I mean those institutions that are legitimate and effective, and they can be informal. They don't have to come from the state. They can be very informal. This gives locals a very high capacity for collective resistance. They also give them a low demand for new governance, and this gives them bargaining power, which in the end makes the scope of non-state groups be smaller or narrower. It really limits the ability of these groups to govern. The second part of
Can I interrupt 1 second? The slides are not moving. Is that on purpose?
Oh, the slides are not moving?
Yes, and thank you to, yeah.
Oh.
So we're still stuck
They
on
are
the
moving
main
on my computer.
Okay, so now we're on slide 19. We haven't seen any of the previous ones, but okay.
Okay, well, it was a summary of what I am saying. Thank you for saying that, Deborah. I don't know, it's so weird. Okay, can you see it moving now?
Now they're moving, now they're moving.
It was in full view, so maybe that's why.
And
okay.
Now it's 20.
So are you seeing number 3?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I hope you have followed what I have said. You didn't really need to see the slides, but you will need now with the data, so thank you. And so the second part of this, so the arguments about the additional unique mechanisms that DRIs trigger, as I said before, the first one is resistance, and the second one is that when you have low quality DRIs, so the ones that are illegitimate or ineffective, this creates a critical gap in governance that these non-state armed groups can fill. And this has been shown not just in my work, but also in other studies of rebel governance. And then because there is this huge gap in governance, armed groups that provide this critical service can more easily centralize authority and expand rule to other domains. And this is something that Deborah finds in her book on a very different type of rulers, which is the big states that we know today in Europe and in other places. And then, as I said, we have a co-author paper really theorizing this more generally. So the conclusion here is that high-quality dispute resolution institutions are likely to reduce the scope of non-state armed governance. And actually, they trigger even more mechanisms affecting the rule of these groups than the other components of state capacity. And then the final argument is that the state of course, can improve governance and in that way undermine non-state armed governance, but it can also disrupt high-quality non-state dispute resolution institutions while not providing a better alternative. So the state arrives to a place that may have good governance, high-quality dispute resolution institutions, but there is a transition phase where if the state is not providing a better alternative, it is actually undermining the quality of governance in that transition phase. And in that way, it can actually facilitate the expansion, the arrival and the expansion of non-state armed groups. Okay, so we have these three hypotheses that I just explained before. The first one is that high-quality dispute resolution is as critical as security, services, and infrastructure. It should undermine the ability of these groups to govern. The second one is that what matters is really the quality and not the presence of these components of state capacity or of governance. And the third one is that the state presence can actually undermine governance and therefore make it easier for these groups to govern. So I'm going to show you data, the results of models, statistical analysis based on this data in Colombia, where I have collected data through different waves of fieldwork, the last one in 2021, where I have collected very detailed data on how these groups govern on different domains. And based on this, I created an index. So you can see here an index of guerrilla, paramilitaries, and criminals. There are different groups in each category. Don't pay attention to the index. This is a specific way in which the index was created, but don't pay attention to the negative. This is using multiple correspondence analysis. But what you can see is that on average, they tend to have a similar scope of governance, right? And there is variation within each category across groups and actually across time as well. So what the models are trying to do is looking at how, if we look at the year before the first armed group arrived, how much does each factor or indicator of state capacity predicts the scope of the intervention of the armed groups in future years, right? So again, 1 year before the first armed group ever arrived to the community, I'm only looking at places that have one armed group present, right? So to get rid of competition and everything that happens when more than one group is fighting. And I'm trying to look at how different components of state capacity may shape the scope of non-state armed group governance. So the first finding that we have is that dispute resolution institutions matter. So here we see that the coefficient, so where the dependent variable is the index of governance, we see that the coefficient is very clearly negative and it's very robust, and we have a lot of robustness checks, and this just really holds very well. Now, what happens when we look at other components? Before that, dispute resolution institutions matter regardless of the source, right? So if this high quality dispute resolution comes from the state, you still get a lower scope of intervention of the rebels and the criminals and the paramilitaries. The same if the ones providing the dispute resolution are civic leaders, and then the same if the ones providing these are the ethnic authorities. Now, what happens if we look at the other components of governance, which usually in these cases is provided by the state? So the presence of an elementary school actually increases the scope of governance by these groups. The presence of a health center in the community doesn't really matter. When you have both an elementary school and a health center, it decreases the scope of intervention, which to me is telling us that when the presence of the state is more consolidated, it starts to make it more difficult for the groups to govern. The presence of a paved road in the community also is positively associated with the scope of governance by these groups. If we look at security, this one is very interesting. The presence of a police station increases the scope of governance by these groups. The presence of the army doesn't do anything, and actually very few of these communities have army presence. When you have both police and army presence, it increases even more the scope of governance by criminals, paramilitaries, and rebels. But if I look at the quality of security, regardless of who is providing it, by measuring how quickly robberies and other types of crimes are solved, then we do find a negative correlation. It's not very robust, but it's there. So These two findings show that dispute resolution institutions seem to be very important. And again, the models are actually very, very demanding. It's a very, very robust result. And it also shows that some forms of presence of the state are actually helping non-state armed groups. So can we look at what is happening here? So we don't have data on specifically on state presence, on the quality of state presence before the armed group, sorry, or the quality of dispute resolution before the state arrives, right? So we cannot know if the state is undermining dispute resolution institutions. But what we can look at is what happens when 1 year before these armed groups arrive, what happens if you have different components of the state and you also have high quality dispute resolution institutions. So we are looking at communities that were able to preserve the high quality dispute resolution, even though the state at some point in the past arrived with its police or the elementary school or the health center. And so what we find here is very interesting. So I'm showing you the models where we have the components of state capacity. So again, 1 year before any armed group arrived, there was an elementary school or a road or police and the army. And then I am looking at the interaction between the presence of state capacity in this way and high quality dispute resolution institutions. And here we see that there is actually a very strong negative effect of state presence, right? So when the state is present without disrupting this quality of dispute resolution, it actually makes it much more difficult for the armed groups to govern, right? And we see the same for the police, for roads, for elementary school. So the conclusion, and I'll end with this, I'm not going to repeat, is that what matters seems to be governance and not the source. It doesn't matter if it's the state or the indigenous communities or very informal peasant institutions. What matters is really the quality. The presence of the police, education, health, infrastructure do not seem to reduce the scope of non-state armed governance by themselves. Even high-quality provision of security does not seem to counter non-state armed governance in any robust way. This negative effect of the state or some components of the state disappears when there are high-quality dispute resolution institutions. What do I think are the implications of this? So the first one is that the state should really avoid disrupting non-state governance when it is working well. And remember that part of working well, in my definition, is legitimacy, right? So if people in the community consider these mechanisms or these institutions as fair and as efficient, then the state should acknowledge the reality, which is that it doesn't have the monopoly on governance yet. And it should try to work with these local non-state authorities instead of viewing them as competitors. And I know, and I hope Dan can talk about this, there are a lot of constitutional challenges of how you do this. But I think accepting the reality on the ground in these territories is absolutely essential, because if we continue to just push for the arrival of the state and for the state to govern alone, we may make things much worse, as these data are showing. Now, the implications for policies where non-state armed groups are already present are less clear, right? We know that dispute resolution is super important, but how do we improve them while non-state armed groups are there? I think here, again, partnering with local providers of high-quality dispute resolution may be critical, but there are other questions about, for example, how do you do this if there are huge security concerns, right? It is very, very challenging, but I think we need to be much more creative in how we approach this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Fascinating introduction to set up the discussion. So, Deborah, floor is yours.
I think, wouldn't it be, because mine is history in the Middle Ages, wouldn't it be more organically connected if Dan went next? To
you prefer? I don't mind. Yeah. So we can close up sort of the contemporary context and then come back to the historical roots.
Yeah. Because mine is from a different world, so.
That's okay, that's okay.
Dan and Anna are in the same world.
Daniel, do you mind to go on second?
No, that's totally fine. I mean, although I have to say my presentation is less about the contemporary world and more about the basic concepts, the sort of first principles of establishing kind of effective and the sort of high quality governance or high quality dispute resolution institutions that Anna was talking about.
Okay.
So and that's kind of where I want to focus my comments, because there's there's a lot of sort of advice out there, kind of technocratic advice about how to build justice institutions, and the World Bank and the OAS and like all kinds of international development banks, and everybody has been sort of working on this for a long time. And it seems to me that sometimes they lose sight of the first principles because they're focusing so much on like ISO standards or something. So I want to take us a little bit back to these first principles, and I'll take a couple of the questions more. I think Anna's clearly the expert on the third question that was sent to me, which is like, how do we compete with other groups that are providing these similar systems? But the first question that I got was sort of how can national and subnational governments collaborate more effectively to build institutions, the sort of high quality dispute resolution institutions that Anna was talking about? And when I talk to my students, when I talk to people about this, even when I start thinking about courts and how to build courts, I mean, one of my recent books was about sort of how we can build national level judicial institutions that have this kind of legitimacy. I haven't really done any work on local level institutions, but I think the same principles sort of apply. So when I start thinking about these things, I draw a lot on somebody that I'm sure Anna and Deborah are both quite familiar with, which is Martin Shapiro's classic work on, on comparative courts and so on. And I always think about the triad, his idea that, the basic unit of human interaction is the dyad, but the dyad is constituted by a normative framework that tells us kind of who we are, what our responsibilities and rights are with respect to each other. And that most of the time we do just fine with dyadic dispute resolution, but change and dynamic circumstances in particular lead us to this sort of triadic dispute resolver to solve the problem of disagreement. And so the core features, he says, and this is a fairly obvious point by now, but is that we consent to the decision maker and the rule. When I have a disagreement with someone in the world of voluntary dispute resolution, we consent to the decision maker and to the rule. We say, this is the agreement we had, and we find some person that we can agree on that's going to help us figure out what we do next, how to resolve this disagreement. And there are a lot of ways in which that basic logic translates up into compulsory dispute resolution and state-based dispute resolution, but also sort of community-based dispute resolution, to kind of as a general term to describe all sorts of informal mechanisms of dispute resolution. So the core element then is consent, which is meant to produce the value that we're trying to achieve, which is this neutral, impartial decision maker and a sort of neutral, impartial rule, a rule that we can agree on. Anna referred to this as fair dispute resolution. I think that's the sort of thing we're looking for. And people talk about judicial independence, and I think what the goal that judicial independence is trying to achieve is this impartial decision maker, right? So, so the problem is that we don't live in a world of voluntary dispute resolution, right? We live in a world of state-based, often dispute resolution, or maybe not state-based, but rebel-based or armed group-based, or but provided sort of ready-made rather than ad hoc and bespoke dispute resolution. And so how do we preserve this idea of a dispute, of a neutral, consensual decision maker and rule in that kind of a world? We need to maintain this illusion of consent, and what's often also an illusion, right? The illusion of the impartiality of the triadic dispute resolver, which I think this is a crucial point. The dispute resolver has to be impartial as to the dyad, right? So I'll say a little bit more about this. Every dispute resolver that's set up by some outside actor has a point of view, has an agenda, right? Is not impartial in any meaningful sense. Any law that we pass is not impartial. That's why we pass laws, to take sides, to say this is okay and this is not, right? But we have to have this kind of illusion, in a way, of sort of consent and impartiality. So how do we do that? I mean, in at the national level and with state-based mechanisms of dispute resolution, we have all these all kinds of ritual and mythology, for one, right? Like judges in robes that sit up high on a dais, right? We have a whole sort of normative mythology of impartial decision makers and the majesty of the law, and all kinds of things that suggest, right, that the law is above our political disagreements, and so on. And the way we produce this in democracies in particular is by providing a form of participation in the production of the decision maker and the rules, right? So in a democracy, we vote for representatives, they make laws, we feel like we have some participation in that. Constitutions are more complicated, but we work really hard through all kinds of mechanisms, which we could talk about, to give people the sense that the Constitution is the product of some sort of effort of popular will and popular participation, right? So participation, again, provides this illusion of consent, and that leads to the sense of impartiality. You know, appointment mechanisms for judges are meant to do the same, right? The reason the U.S. Supreme Court is in such dire straits right now with respect to legitimacy is in very large part because a lot of people, particularly people on the left, think the mechanism of appointment to the court was captured by the right. So those people aren't impartial, right? I didn't consent to those people. The other side chose them, and now they're going to decide what the Constitution means to me, right? So that's kind of, I think, what we're trying to replicate when we create these more local mechanisms of dispute resolution. So how do we do that? I think Anna mentioned one of these, and there are some examples which I'll come back to later. But we need to replicate that notion of participation in the production of the decision maker and the rule, right? So mechanisms of appointment and selection of the dispute resolver, right? Some form of local participation in that, so that they're not parachuting in from the outside, right? Even if it's like descriptive representation, right? People that look like the local population, that can also provide some sort of sense that they are a member and a product of our community, right? Some approximation of participation in shaping the law, which is odd. I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but which is odd when we think, especially in unitary states like Colombia and so many others in Latin America, right? That there would be sort of legal production at the local level. But we can either, you know, we can, through public rituals and whatnot, we can remind people of their participation in producing laws, or we can actually kind of produce laws at the local level. The common law, Deborah knows this way better than I do, but you know, juries can also produce this sense of local participation in decision making, right? That's one of the justifications for the jury in the US, right? They import community norms into the decision making process, right? There's I think a really interesting experience mostly in Africa and Asia, with what are sometimes referred to as barefoot lawyers, right? Community paralegals that are sort of the legal equivalent of community health workers. And they're also sort of very grounded in the local community. So, you know, all these things, participation in the production of norms, participation in the naming of dispute resolvers, rituals and reminders of how much we as a community produce our own justice systems and our own laws, right? So that's one thing, but I think particularly the question was about extending the reach of dispute resolution and dispute resolution institutions across heterogeneous territories and populations. And I think one of the challenges in doing that is to actually provide some normative heterogeneity, to use fancy words to say, the law can't be the same everywhere if the population is not the same everywhere. There has to be some way of accommodating norms to the reality, to the lived experiences, and to the normative expectations of the local populations, right? And that, I know kind of ruffles feathers among traditional lawyers in Latin America, like a lot. The state is supposed to be unitary. There's supposed to be legal monism. The state is supposed to have a monopoly on the production of the law. But, there's a way in which some level of heterogeneity is completely inevitable and unavoidable, right? Also, Shapiro tells us that dispute resolvers actually produce law all the time when they're deciding disagreements, right? And no legal system is complete. No legal system is fully predictive of everything that's going to come up, right? So the dispute resolvers always produce law. All legal systems have lacuna and interstices within which resolution happens. And controlling the dispute resolver often means controlling the production of law. The problem is that when you're creating local systems, is that there are plenty of or anti-democratic local power systems that will inevitably have a lot of influence on the dispute resolver, right? And so no democratic system can abandon control over the production of laws to systems that are captured by anti-democratic local power structures, right? And so how do we do that, right? How do we balance this need for normative heterogeneity, for the appropriateness of the norm to the local community, and the need for universal democratic citizenship, right? This is often attributed to St. Augustine, but this idea that in the essentials unity and in the non-essentials liberty, right, I think is what we have to find. And the challenge, of course, is in finding the line between what's essential and what's not essential. But, I think the Colombian Constitutional Court has done some of this work already in the context of indigenous justice systems, community dispute resolution, and so on. So there's resources there. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. In any case, I think practically, institutionally, the way to square the circle is to provide that level of participation at the local level in producing the decision maker and the norm, but then retaining the connection between the decision maker and the center. Right. So I'm thinking of things like, in the US, for example, the early judges used to ride circuit. They would go out into the communities and decide cases, but then they would eventually come back to their sede, to their central kind of office. The Colombian Constitutional Court did the same for a while. And I think we've seen from research in other contexts that this sort of cycling of dispute resolvers, of adjudicators out into the community and back to some central place where they can interact with, get training by, generate networks of other sort of similarly minded and with adjudicators with similar challenges, that can really, I think, produce a sense of a shared normative framework among the dispute resolvers, right? So we have research that shows that, for example, judges who are embedded in international networks of judges are often much more resistant to political pressures and so on, just because they have that support network outside of their local political community, right? And the same, I think, if you have dispute resolvers that come from the local community, but that go to a judicial school, come back once a year for capacitación and training of one kind or another, that have that continued kind of interaction with other judges, other dispute resolvers in other contexts. And they could be formal judges, or they could be what we used to call justices of the peace, or, local community dispute resolvers, with varying degrees of training. I think that the key is to keep a sort of vibrant connection on the normative side between the people who are out in the communities doing the work and the center and the production of democratic norms, right? So that's, I think, the two things that I think high quality local justice systems have to have. They have to have this sense of local participation, local consent to the dispute resolver and the rule, and a strong connection to the center, and support systems that can prevent the capture of local dispute resolvers by local power structures, right? I mean, we see that a lot, not just where there are armed gangs or military actors, right? Rebels. We see everywhere. Guillermo O'Donnell wrote about this a million years ago when he talked about brown areas, right? There are places where the normative dimension of the state is absent and is replaced by a different normative framework. Anyway, and Anna knows a lot more about this than I do. So, so those are kind of, I think, the big sort of the true north, right? Is consent, impartiality, participation, and connection to the center. The second question was like, well, what questions can we learn from countries that have successfully done this? Well, that assumes facts not in evidence, as lawyers would say, that some people have had successful efforts. But I think they're not a million examples, but I think there are some examples, right? And I think there's this cool book. I think it's by my former co-author Varun Gori and Vivek Maru. Vivek Maru runs this sort of community paralegal NGO, and they talk a lot about community paralegals, which are also referred to as barefoot lawyers. They provide a really kind of essential service, and they're sort of low. So Varun at the time worked for the World Bank, so they were really excited because it's low cost. It seems quite effective. The cases aren't mostly in Latin America. They're mostly in Africa, like South Africa, Kenya. Sierra Leone has had a lot of experiences with this. Liberia, places with what people think of as weak states, like Sierra Leone and Liberia, in particular, relied on this for a long time. And in Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, places where it is hard for the central state to project out into different places. So I think that's one thing, and from the perspective of the sort of big principles we were just talking about, right? Community paralegals come from the community and are part of shaping the legal landscape that people have to engage with. And then this is a much smaller point, but I think, Chile was one of the few, I think more or less all the countries eventually got it more or less right. But, when we were rolling out oral procedures for criminal cases in particular, Chile did something that I thought was quite effective. And that was, the problem with the justice system is that it needs to be vertically integrated. You have to have capacity beginning at the very front end with the intake, kind of like the police and the lawyers and all the ways in which cases come into the justice system or to the dispute resolution system, all the way up to the ultimate source of normative authority, right? And so the challenge is to do that across the entire territory at one time. That's incredibly difficult. And so what Chile did was it rolled out sort of vertically integrated pieces of this in delimited territories. And that made the challenge much more manageable, but it ensured the success of the efforts where they were happening. So that's just one thing I guess I would mention. Don't try to do the whole country at once. The last thing I would say on this, on sort of positive examples and what can we learn, particularly because you mentioned access to justice, is we really need to expand how we understand access to justice. I think the traditional model is kind of like, well, justice is like an apple on the tree of justice, you know, and if you just give people a long enough ladder, they can climb the ladder and pick the apple. And the problem is that that's not what justice is like at all, right? I mean, justice is not something you can pick if you just get access to it. It's more like the terrain. It's a contested terrain in which people go and sort of fight out contested notions of what's right and what's fair and what's just, right? It's something that you construct through participation and through struggle. And so for a lot of communities, right, the problem is not just that they can't get in, or that they don't understand the language, or they don't have access to lawyers, or that they're too many miles from the nearest office. The problem is that once they get in, the inequality doesn't disappear, right? I mean, so that there is always, of course, the problem of being able to navigate the system as it is, right? That's true, and it's real, and it's a real problem. But there's another inequality that's more fundamental, and that also has to do with access to justice. And this is something we learned from Mark Galanter in the 1970s already, which is that the haves, which is what he labels the people who have kind of full access to justice, get to shape the system through their participation in the system, right? So you have to have access to the tools that actually produce what the notion of justice that the system is going to use to decide your dispute. This is just another way of saying what I said earlier, that you need to sort of agree that the rule is fair, right? Before you'll be sort of in agreement that the dispute resolution system is fair. Right? So the challenge is not just to lower the bar to entry to the legal system, but to equalize the conditions under which people can shape the landscape and contest the outcomes once they're in. And for this is easy to see, I think, if we think of indigenous groups, right, where substantive notions of justice might be quite different from the ones, right? Like the way they would choose to the way they evaluate, for example, retributive justice versus restorative justice in the system and in the outcomes, right, it is quite different from what the state-based national level system is providing, right? So I think this is sort of, I'm bringing us back to this idea of normative heterogeneity, right? You have to give people some role in shaping the system. And this could be through the use of the barefoot lawyers, through participation in selecting the decision makers, and so on. So that's what I guess I would say, just ensure that we're not rolling out cookie cutter solutions across the whole territory, but rather providing some space in the non-essentials for the local community to shape the system itself so that it aligns better with their normative expectations, with what they think is fair and right and impartial. So that's more or less what I have. I mean, I haven't really looked at the role of criminal organizations, and so I'm going to let Anna speak to that, and I'm sure Deborah has a lot to say about how you create a sort of national state-based system of laws that's eventually going to win out over what was there before. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Fantastic, a fantastic reflection on what actually makes how to create a justice system and what are the critical elements to keep in mind for it. And so now Deborah can take us back in time and tell us how this was done in the so-called already formed strong states before us, before our time. Thank you so much, Deborah.
Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a drastic change of scenery, but I hope to convince you that there are, I think Dan also suggested, there are lessons that can be learned that do travel through time and may offer some inspiration, at least at points. So I'm going to focus on lessons from medieval England and Europe in general about the role of justice and power, right? Because those two have to be considered in tandem. And there are two main lessons that I think come out of the English experience. One is this idea that justice is really central. I mean, it's a platitude, but at the same time, as Dan can say, and as we're arguing with Anna, in political science, it tends to be ignored. It's as a fundamental function of the state. But what can be shown, I think, is that it's not just essential for the emergence of the state, it's essential to the emergence of representative government and democracy, right? These are intricately linked in many ways that I'll try to briefly summarize. And the other point is that when we're looking at the English state and how it developed the kind of constitutional liberal governance that has served as an inspiration for so many countries, it's that it certainly does not eschew mano dura policies, right? I'm afraid I have to be very clear about that, but I think it offers a very interesting lesson, which is that where it does employ coercion, and it does it very effectively, more effectively than any other European ruler, is that it does so over the most powerful, not over the people. And I think this is one part that is misunderstood even in sort of old classics like Huntington. So the reason why justice is absolutely central is because it is the one source of interaction between rulers and ruled that is truly bottom up, right? And it's also universal and constant. So when we say universal, it's the demand for justice is found everywhere, indigenous groups, and we're going to see very similar mechanisms. This is truly a universal pattern. And of course, the demand for justice is constant across different areas, across different social strata. And unlike taxation, so if you read state building literature, everybody's focusing on taxation and using that as a key mechanism to sort of build capacity, et cetera. The problem with taxation is that it's not really that regular. I mean, and I kind of show that in my empirical work. I don't have a lot of empirics here. I thought I'd focus on the ideas. But if you look at the emergence of the English Parliament, less than, like 15, 20% of meetings of the early English Parliament dealt with taxation. If the English Parliament was sort of focused on taxation, it would have met as often as the French one did, and it wouldn't have resulted in a constitutional system. What the English Parliament did is it actually integrated justice, which is the kind of genuine bottom-up demand. Right? So let me just take the 2 points one by one and make a few points. So the centrality of justice and the emergence of representative government. Now, the key to understand this integral connection is that the administration of justice really structured representative activity in the emergence of parliament. And this isn't a phenomenon unique to England. Most European countries showed similar patterns, only not as effectively instituted. Now, the key here is that Parliament, which we assume now to be a kind of completely a political institution was a court. And in fact, in the English case, it was a court up until 2005, right? It's called the High Court of Parliament, and it was a session of the King's Court that delivered justice, right? And this idea of the ruler dispensing justice in some central institution, you find it everywhere. You find it in Russia with the Tsar, you find it in the Ottoman Empire, you find it, in the absolutist regimes of Europe. It's everywhere. The argument in my book that I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to get a sense, is that you get representation as a regular structuring activity that defines the regime, where justice, which was regular, overlaps with taxation demands, which are irregular, right? So our existing literature can't explain parliaments because they're using taxation, which doesn't explain the regularity. Justice does, because it's always there as a demand. And to see how Parliament is basically encased in a judicial system, you need to understand that it was in fact just another session of the King's Court, and court has this dual meaning of a royal thing, but also a court of justice. And of course, these institutions combine both. And the king met in some cases in Parliament with representatives, and in other cases with some nobles. And he had these different institutions that you can see here, right, that were in... some dealt with fiscal functions, other dealt with, purely judicial concerns like Common Pleas and King's Bench. And these central institutions were complemented by exactly the point that Dan was making before, by these itinerant commissions that were regularly sent out into the provinces, either like the General Ire, which was like every 7 years, or more frequently quarter sessions for these different types of courts. And Parliament was really the centerpiece, really, in this judicial infrastructure, right? Of course, there were other courts as well, but this is really the system of royal judicial institutions. And Parliament was only one, right? It was just a session of the King's Court. Now, another very important theme that I think we forget in today's liberal discourse, which is all about rights and forgets, obligations. Obligations tend to be assumed to be conservative. That's a very problematic thing to neglect when examining these dynamics, because first of all, historically, representation originally was like jury duty. Right? And people avoided it like jury duty. They would have excuses. They would have to present elaborate excuses to misrepresentation. It wasn't something that, the people demanded from below, right? The king forced them to attend Parliament, and they had to pay for that, and they had to pay if they didn't attend. Now, again, underscoring the kind of fundamental integral connection between the two is that the same process that produced the jurors and structured the judicial system was the same process that produced representatives, right? So it had to do with sheriffs and being called, and you were getting a summons, which again, you couldn't refuse, etc. So if you didn't have a well-organized and centralized judicial structure operating at the behest of the crown, you weren't going to be able to organize representative activity at the center. So you find assemblies in Russia in the 17th century meeting, having all the features of the system that we know, but they couldn't. The rulers, the Tsars, couldn't actually convince people to come to the center, right? Because they couldn't enforce the obligation, and because the institutional structure was not as well enforced. And finally, and I think this again may have resonance today. I think it already does in a certain way, but maybe can do so in a more programmatic way. Again, going back to Dan's point about ensuring that there's a connection between the local and this central system, is that what Parliament basically consisted of originally was it was an institution where petitions were presented. And these were originally individual petitions, but what England did better than any other European country, again, compared even to Russia or the Ottoman Empire or, certainly the other European cases, is that it more effectively organized the collective aggregation of demands from across counties and boroughs. So, what you would have is you would have petitions being collected, right? And it's a complicated process. Some of it would happen actually in Parliament, this aggregation. And on the basis of those petitions, you would get legislation, right? So what we call legislation was in fact the result of this, right? The word bill originally meant petition, right? And so you have already from the 1300s and 1400s in England, a direct contribution of the locality. By the early 1400s, the English Commons was not only proposing legislation, so saying we need this thing to be fixed, right? They would actually propose the remedy itself, which was adopted in Parliament. And this was basically selecting concerns which originally were not purely political. They were kind of in between judicial petitions for justice, for correcting wrongs, and these are often trivial, mundane, everyday things. I mean, we think of the English Parliament and we think of Locke and security of rights, etc. This started with, he's stealing my cow, he's going over my land. I mean, just mundane, everyday demands that would then get some kind of aggregate sort of form, which is then how you get legislation. And as I've said, where England differed from absolutist countries was in the more effective aggregation of concerns throughout the territory. And here again is a really important point, which we need to be considering, because I understand the Colombian and other state builders are really strong on this. And I think we don't need to lose sight of this, right? Being able to integrate the whole territory and limiting fragmentation, I argue, is really fundamental in allowing representative governance, as we understand it, to prevail. And you can see this very strikingly if you compare with Castile, right? So when we say Castilian absolutism, what do we mean? We don't mean a system that didn't have representation. Of course it did. The Cortes were thriving and really strong and met regularly, right? What's the difference with England? And I don't want to reduce it to that, but it's certainly a major difference that hasn't been emphasized enough. It's that the only groups that were included were the towns. And in fact, they kind of eventually reduced the number of towns. They created a kind of monopoly. And this isn't just particular to Castile. If you look at France, when you look at French absolutism, again, the third estate is represented only by the cities. It doesn't include the countryside. So you have this mass of the population that isn't included in a process where they can directly forward their petitions and demands to the center in an institutionalized way. And just for the record, I go through and I try to show these patterns across a number of cases. So let me now say a few things about this idea of the strong hand, which is the biggest problem, especially from the perspective of the left. If you are committed to a system that, I mean, it's not just the left, it's progress, I would argue, in civilization, that you want to be achieving, results without using violence, right? I mean, that is the goal. Paper stones, right? Instead of stoning the ruler, we use ballots in order to get rid of a ruler we don't like. So, the question of the use of violence is a kind of thorn on the side of any kind of policy with that kind of aim. And it's also the weak part of the left, because then, as the description of the conference says, you have the populists who invoke the need to, install order, and then they get the votes. So what can England tell us about this very difficult dilemma? And I think here it's an important and rather neglected point, which becomes totally obvious once you've said it, but I think it certainly hasn't been obvious in the literature, right? The one thing that distinguished the English state was not all these beautiful stories that you hear about a balance between the nobility and the Magna Carta and the rights of the people. That is really endogenous and secondary. What truly puts England on a different level than other European countries is that the English state starts with the greatest capacity to compel the most powerful, right? So, and here, I'm sorry to say that violence was pretty brutal. Now, we don't have to replicate medieval patterns of state building, but there is something very important going on here, right? First of all, they invade, the Normans invade England, and they decapitate literally the Anglo-Saxon, they defeated them, and they literally decapitated a number of the, and then they basically took over all their lands and completely changed the distribution of the lands, giving them to their Norman supporters, right? So you get rid of that takes blood, right? As Barrington Moore reminded us, democracy does require that is a big problem. Then the other major point is that the English rulers retained the upper hand by having a legal system where all land was held of the king, is the official term, right? So even today, technically, there's no owners of land in England. They're all tenants, right? And that was certainly the case then. Even the highest nobility still depended on the crown for the holdings that they had. And this control of land, which was unlike in Europe, where you had large areas, latifundia, large areas that were outside royal jurisdiction, all that land was accessible for the crown to tax, which is why they ended up taxing it 3 to 4 times higher per capita. And I have original data showing that than France, right, which is the other country that we have systematic data, and certainly compared to Castile and other countries. Now, one key reason for that is that the English were able to tax their aristocracy, right? Again, it's this idea of power over the most powerful, right? That is key. And what's more is that they could compel this nobility to do all sorts of service, military, judicial. The nobles heard petitions in Parliament. They complained bitterly about it. They had to be ordered to sit down and, but they were obligated to do that. But that tied them into the institution and then developed incentives to actually, not get rid of the institution, but to control it. And that was key for the survival of Parliament over time, right? And of course, taxation is another kind of imposition that the English kings could do. So unfortunately, we don't have systematic comparative data with other cases, but we do know that there's, we know from anecdotal, historical qualitative data that I go through in the book that especially France, which is the major competitor, does not compete with the kind of service that the English kings could impose. And military service, attendance in Parliament, right? This is from data I've collected from a database of nobles in the 1200s. And this is a minimum because this is just where we have references that tell us that a certain noble was actually forced to do judicial service, but at least 40% were obligated to participate. And almost 40% of them had at some point their estates forfeited or seized. So we're talking about an English crown that just basically, the noble didn't perform, they would take the lands away. Maybe for good, maybe for a certain time. So there is a certain amount of A, violence, and B, coercion that is occurring there that is unmatched, but it is violence and coercion against the most powerful, right? So this is one element of this, and it is counterbalanced by the other, which legal historians know very well, which is that already from the 12th century, the English kings differentiated themselves from other sort of cases and countries where you had legal distinctions between the nobility and the commoners. In England, as long as you were free, you were subject to the same royal law. There were no privileges, right? This is what the common law, in fact, in many instances, the law that applied to the rich, right, and the big power holders was far more restrictive than it was to the freemen underneath. So in terms of alienation, inheritance, more restrictions on the powerful than there were on the common man. So there's this kind of balance that actually ends up creating a system where the judicial system in particular is used in order to undercut the basis of the most powerful, right? And the most critical version of that is they took over their courts. So the crown took over a big battle in the 13th century to basically push out local justice and to centralize, right? That is part of the central part of the English story. And it would not have occurred if those common law courts were not actually offering justice that was faster and fairer in many ways than what they were getting in noble courts, right? So when you have these petitions opening up and these sort of itinerant courts, and there's certain new writs, legal instruments, thousands and thousands of people just flock to the royal courts to basically get served in that way. So let me just conclude by going back to the old Huntington claim that I think was beloved by many authoritarians, surely in Latin America as well. So he claimed to have this conclusion from, European history that, well, if you don't have strong institutions like, England did, then, well, yes, you might need to suppress popular participation, right? So, if you want to avoid populism, right, just suppress the people, build strong institutions, and then things will fall into place. That, I argue, is not the lesson from the European history. I think it's that the countries that Huntington is focusing on, and it's mainly England, what they achieved was this power over the most powerful. And when you're seeing populist tendencies, they are a response to the inadequate control over the elites. I mean, if you just think about America today, just think about any country, when you have the people protesting in what appears then as a populist movement, there's always some, going back to the problems of inequality, right, and redistribution, there's always some concern that the pie is not being distributed well. And in order to get that done, that should be your primary concern. So that's it, I'm done. I realize that I'm almost done. I did want to say, just finish up with emphasizing 2 points. One is that in talking about the centrality of justice in political processes, right, like representation and democracy, it might sound like I'm arguing in favor of a fusion of judicial and political, sort of legislative or executive authority. But I think there's an important distinction that isn't made when we're making the arguments about separation of courts and separation of justice and the executive or the legislature. That is obviously necessary at the institutional level. So you don't want judges who are just basically puppets of political authority. But there's a whole realm of activity at the local basis where these two fields interact. And I think petitions are central there because they're kind of in between concerns about, I mean, you petition because you think that there's something wrong, right? There's some kind of right of yours that is being violated or something of the sort. But that, eventually becomes a political act, right, through legislation. There's that level of interaction between the two, the petitions in particular, which are, after all, extremely popular again, now that democracy is suffering across countries, across advanced industrialized countries. We have, petitions are pretty popular. And I think that is an important point to recall. And I think I have one more, but I think I'll leave it there because I'm up for my time. So.
Well, thank you so much, really. I mean, I definitely convinced that it was absolutely worth it to fight for this last session about this topic. And I'm sort of laughing that the three of you, when I contacted you in a very short notice last week, said, oh, no, it's not enough time, it's just a couple of days. And look at kind of presentations you have given us. So really, thank you so much. You're quite an expert on this topic and help us understanding this. I think there is a couple of questions in the audience that I want to take first before going into. So there is a question. I don't know if it's exactly related to anyone in particular, but I should read it first. Should the state be pragmatic and avoid intervening in a region where there is a strong governance and good quality dispute resolution provided by a non-state actor, even if this non-state actor is a criminal one? I guess that's a question probably for Anna. What if the strong dispute resolution which is in place, as we know, Anna, for example, in the case of the combos in Medellin. So many people investigating this topic, Santiago Tobón, among others, will say, well, the combos are able to regulate the territory, They do it with less violence. They regulate the commerce at the local level, local disputes, and apparently they did it well, and they have the support. So should the state just not mess that up and accept the fact that a criminal combo is better than whatever alternative to the state is, or what should the state should attempt to do? Ana.
Yeah, that's a good and perhaps a difficult question, but I think that because in most cases, criminal governance and rebel governance and paramilitary governance happens where you have a lot of carrots like this, in the sense that you're providing a service, but there are so many sticks, right? So people who live in places where these groups are governing are living in a very authoritarian micro order, right? And I think this is largely overlooked when we think of civil war, where we think of violence a lot, but we don't think about the authoritarian parts of that. And so, yes, these groups often provide dispute resolution. It's more effective than, the state, if it is available. And sometimes it may have some sense of legitimacy because people actually appreciate the service, and they may even think that the ways in which disputes are solved tends to be impartial and fair, right? And I think there is a reason for this, why it is strategic for the groups to do that. But I think what we should focus on here is that these groups do this mostly in communities that didn't have other forms of high quality dispute resolution institutions to begin with. The fact that the group is doing this makes it much more difficult for the state to come in and do anything, even like limiting the authoritarian parts of the governance. So while I am arguing that we should think of creative ways of working with non-state providers of high quality dispute resolution, and I think Dan's intervention was amazingly, it gave me a lot of hope. Well, I'm arguing that for the case of non-state providers that are not armed groups, I'm not making the same arguments for armed groups. And again, the reason is they are using that violence for a lot of bad things.
But I want to follow with a couple of questions, because I absolutely share Deborah's assessment of Samuel Huntington argument, that you should simply repress the people until you actually have a proper, formal, strong state, and then things, will come up somehow. I certainly, disagree, and I have a sort of discontent with that argument. But I have to say also that this famous statement of Samuel Huntington, that what matters is not the type, but the degree of government, is something that I've come to realize as a practitioner, as a public servant, as a mayor, that has some, he has a point. And I think that's part of the argument that Ana is giving. Sort of, yes, we don't, has to admit that criminal dispute resolution is dead and we should not do anything about it or confront it. But at the same time, if there is something in place that is not criminal, that is social based, which has some level of effectiveness and legitimacy, because probably they have some of the elements that Daniel mentioned, right? They have voice and participation and some level of agreement, or that rule is going to be fair. That degree of government, even if it is not the type of state-driven government, is much better than anything. And trying to be humble on sort of accepting that that's what is in place and trying to sort of mimic and learn upon it could be a much more useful way to do building a state. So I don't know, Deborah and Daniel and Ana, how could we deal with to form degree of governance, regardless of the type, but the type cannot be criminal because we cannot surrender to the criminal. So how can we deal with that conundrum, both in historical terms, how was it done, Deborah, and maybe in more contemporary terms, how it could be done, Ana and Daniel. I don't know if Deborah maybe want to start on this question or not.
Yeah, no, it's a tiny little question I can answer in, but it has a very simple answer. I mean, it's perfectly obvious. The only thing that I would say is that for me, the most important thing is to have a goal where you're really trying to constantly sort of maintain a balance between this, what you're doing with those who concentrate power and what you're doing with those at the lower ends of. Right. So if you're keeping that polarity in mind and constantly understanding that if you don't keep that balance, and it's not a balance, right? You want the powerful suppressed and then rather, let me say, I think that is the principle that has to be guiding whatever policies you adopt. And if you do that, it's going to lead you in the right direction, because otherwise, if you keep leaning in another direction and you're just governing, you might end up in an authoritarian regime. I mean, that's what people are concerned in this country, right? So I have no other sort of trick. I think this is what the English were doing very well in the early stages. Then it got worse. So as the nobility started gaining power in these institutions from effectively the 14 and 1500s, the English system was becoming more absolutist. And then you need a revolution in order to, again, shift the balance towards the... So that is my response.
Yeah, I always think, I don't know if, thank you. I always think that one of the reasons that the England state is that they beheaded a king like 5 centuries before than the French beheaded a king with Charles I. That's part of the...
Yeah, but they still have the king, so that's not... they still have the king, so the beheading, I think, shouldn't... I think that was a momentary act of violence. I don't think it... anyway, they still haven't beheaded the whole thing.
Anna, how to manage to do this degree of government, but keeping in mind that not any type, certainly not criminal type, should be the accepted answer or solution.
Yeah, so I think there are two different challenges here. So one is, of course, like the fact that in some places what you have is criminal groups governing. But another one is that we also cannot sort of idolize non-state providers, right? That are not violent. So for example, I didn't show you this data, but in my data, if you look at the quality of dispute resolution institutions before armed groups arrive, civic leaders or social leaders, what we call in Colombia líderes sociales, sometimes are amazing, but not all of them have like high quality dispute resolution, right? So in many places, people said we go to a social leader, but then it was not legitimate, it was not effective, right? So I think, and that's why Dan's intervention gave me hope. I thought, okay, so participation is really the root of consent. There should be maybe some creative way of allowing people to decide if what they have on the ground works, which I had thought of this before, but I always thought that doesn't make sense. But then listening to Dan, I was like, well, but yes, that is actually like in any normative theory, sort of the basis of legitimacy is this consent. So I was thinking, could there be something like the consulta previa, which for non-experts on Colombia is like a way in which now the law requires that municipalities ask the local population for certain types of projects, for example, for mining or some kinds of things. So I was thinking, could we have something where people could say, you know, we usually go to X person or X cooperative or whatever, and we think it's really fair. And I think that combined with Dan's amazing idea of like this judicial training every year, like this support. And let me quickly connect this to something else. There is work on Mexico that finds that what allowed indigenous communities in Mexico to resist criminal governance was not just strong local institutions as in my work, but also the network of local institutions across municipalities, right? So connecting this to Dan's point, it could give these providers more strength, more abilities also to slowly maybe bring this dispute resolution to the state, but from below. And going back to Deborah's point, right? Like really sort of connecting them, not like this like parachuting of the state, arriving in a place, disrupting everything, right? So I think one of the implications of the findings in my data is that what seems really, really troublesome is this transition moment.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe in the long term, the state will centralize authority in these places, but the transition is costing a lot, a lot.
Yeah. So for Daniel, I really love this idea, as he said, this sort of fancy name of normative heterogeneity. I love it. I love it because I think something that we should, Daniel, include as a principle of reality and lawmaking and state building in Latin America. I mean, you don't go from non-being the monopoly of power and justice and coercion and goods provision to the next day, be the monopoly. There has to be some sort of transition. And in that transition, states should include as part of its constitutional mindset that heterogeneity in regulation, not because of population, it's not because the population is different, it's not because the territory or the geography is different, which of course they are different, it's because the state presence and capacity and legitimacy is different. And it's much better to accept that and to create different standards and forms and methods of regulation of not only criminal things, just informal things. Just maybe not criminal, but illegal things. Rather than to say, oh, no, I'm supposed to be the monopoly. So the only thing that I could do is just to pretend to be the enforcer, even if I'm not.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, I'm supposed to be the enforcer. I don't have the state capacity yet in place to do that. So I will start by regulating. Even if it is an illegal and informal, I will accept that I cannot enforce. And in order for someday to enforce, I will follow this sort of transition. The same way that you have democratic transitions, you have state building transitions. What do you think about that? Or are we just crazy about it?
No, no. I mean, so this is, I think, this is something that people who've looked at indigenous justice systems and so on have thought about as well, right? And one of the, I think there's a little bit of a tension, so we have in the United States, we have legal pluralism that's been around for 200 years. We call it federalism. And and it varies dramatically, right? Like I could do things in Texas that the state would kill me for, and if I did the same things in Boston, where you are, the state could not kill me for those things. That's a pretty significant difference. So the question is, do we understand this as purely transitional, or are there some things that we would understand as functional to the establishment of a national community that feels fair to people over the long term? I mean, I tend to be more of I'm not a huge fan of federalism as practiced in the US. And because I think it's often been used to shelter subnational kind of mini authoritarian systems, at least as often as it has been a laboratory of democracy, not more often. And I think the same can be true for these more informal or non-state local justice systems. But I think the way to move from one to the other is through the use of soft power rather than hard power, right? So to provide more normatively more attractive solutions to problems, right? To empower local people to assert their voices if they're suppressed. Like, I'm thinking specifically about the role of women in, say, Guatemala, right? When Guatemala was providing more space, or Peru, they were providing more space for indigenous justice systems to act. And one concern was, well, they're embedded in this patriarchal kind of, exclusionary authority system. But over time, right, that changed, and it changed pretty dramatically in Guatemala through, not because the state said, we're going to impose gender equality, which they couldn't do. There was no way, as you said, like there was no way you were going to do that from one day to the next. But by providing a context in which women gradually became more active and powerful and vocal members of those communities, and they changed it from the inside, right? And so there was less resistance and more acceptance and more convergence on the democratic ideals than you would have had if, as you say, you try to impose a rule that you don't actually have the capacity to enforce.
Yeah.
Right. So I think providing that kind of support and training and providing more normatively attractive solutions is the way to move from where you are to where you want to be.
Well, thank you so much. I think in that hopeful note of moving from soft power to more central legitimate power could be a path forward. Thank you so much to the three of you. It has been a fantastic session, and thank you to Dr. Klaas for the support of this 5-session seminar about challenges of security and justice in Latin America. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia.